Did you know there are stories in the Bible so mysterious and controversial that almost no one dares to talk about them? Today, we'll dive into one of the most overlooked yet intriguing topics, the forgotten twins of the Bible. Esau and Jacob, Perez and Zerah. These stories hide intense rivalries, surprising curses, and even clues about the end of times. But here's the question: why did God choose twins to play such critical roles? Does this reveal something about destiny, free will, or even the final battle between good and evil? And the scariest question, are we living something similar without realizing it? Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you'll discover about these forgotten twins may completely change the way you view the scriptures, and maybe even your life. The stories of twins in the Bible seem to hold more than just family rivalries. Behind the decisions of Esau and Jacob, Perez and Zerah, there are hints of something greater, an invisible spiritual conflict that shapes destinies, where hidden forces at play, influencing choices and separating brothers who were meant to walk together. Esau and Jacob, they were already fighting before they were born, a foreshadowing of a rivalry that would echo through generations. Esau, a man of the land, represented instinct and the immediate, while Jacob sought something greater, the spiritual blessing. But was Esau's behavior purely human, or were there spiritual forces at play, distancing him from the divine purpose? And what about Perez and Zerah? In Genesis 38, we see the literal struggle in the womb, where Zerah seemed destined to be born first, but Perez broke through and took his place. The Bible is clear about the reality of these spiritual forces. In Ephesians 6:12, Paul writes, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." Could this spiritual battle have been present in the lives of these twins, and does it still act today, creating conflicts that challenge God's plan? We start with the story of Esau and Jacob, one of the greatest examples of how sibling conflict can shape destinies and reveal the mysteries of God's plan. From the womb, the Bible gives us clues that something grand was coming. In Genesis 25:22 we read, "And the children struggled together within her." This struggle wasn't just physical, it was a reflection of a spiritual confrontation that would mark the destiny of entire nations. When Esau was born, everything seemed to follow the natural course. He was the firstborn, strong, connected to the earth, and naturally destined for the birthright. But Jacob, when born holding his brother's heel, already showed that he wouldn't passively accept second place. This action was prophetic, a sign that roles were about to be reversed. But the true drama begins with the exchange of the birthright. In Genesis 25:29-34, we see Esau, hungry after a hunt, asking Jacob for a bowl of lentils. Jacob, the opportunist, makes a bold proposal to trade the birthright for food. Esau agrees. Here, deep theological questions arise. Did Esau devalue what was sacred? Or did Jacob manipulate a moment of weakness? The text doesn't just narrate an event, it reveals a contrast between spiritual value and immediate desire. Esau preferred to satisfy the body, while Jacob aimed for something eternal. What can we learn from this? That often momentary choices can affect generations. However, this episode was not the end of the dispute. In Genesis 27:18-29, we read the story of the stolen blessing. With Rebekah's help, Jacob disguises himself as Esau, deceiving his father Isaac, who was old and nearly blind. Isaac, believing he was blessing Esau, speaks powerful words over Jacob, guaranteeing him leadership and prosperity. When Esau discovers what happened, his desperate cry resounds in Genesis 27:34. "Bless me, even me also, O my father." This scene is full of emotion and tension. Rejected, Esau swears revenge, while Jacob, now bearing the blessing, is forced to flee to save his life. For years, Jacob lived as a fugitive, carrying both the blessing and the guilt. On his journey, God revealed himself to him at Bethel, in a dream where angels ascended and descended a ladder that touched heaven. Genesis 28:10 through 17. This moment was a turning point. God confirmed that the divine plan was upon Jacob, but not without challenges. The blessing wasn't just a privilege, it was also a responsibility. Jacob would face many difficulties before reconciling with his past. The brothers' reunion, years later in Genesis 33, is one of the most emotional moments in the Bible. Esau, instead of attacking Jacob, runs to meet him and embraces him. This gesture of forgiveness breaks expectations and shows that even amidst such intense conflicts, God can bring reconciliation. But this peace does not erase the fact that the descendants of Esau and Jacob, the Edomites and Israelites, would continue to rival for centuries, showing that the choices of parents reverberate through generations. Esau and Jacob show us that human choices matter, but that God's plan always prevails. The story of Perez and Zerah may seem brief at first, but it is filled with symbolism and mystery. Located in Genesis 38, it occurs in the context of the tumultuous life of Judah, one of Jacob's sons, and Tamar, his daughter-in-law. This episode, full of twists and seemingly ordinary decisions, actually carries one of the greatest messages about divine purpose, lineage, and the impact of human choices. It all starts with Tamar, who, after being widowed by two sons of Judah, disguises herself to ensure her place in the lineage. When she conceives, no one could have imagined that the birth of her children would carry such deep symbolism. In Genesis 38:27-30, we read, "And it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass when she travailed that the one put out his hand. And the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, This came out first. And it came to pass, as he drew back his hand, that, behold, his brother came out. And she said, How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Perez. And afterward came out his brother, that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah." What seemed like a complication in childbirth reveals something deeper. Zerah, the first to put out his hand, was marked as the firstborn with the scarlet thread. However, Perez, his brother, broke through and was born first. This event is a powerful metaphor. Divine blessing doesn't always follow human expectations. God's choice once again defies cultural and biological norms. The scarlet thread, marking Zerah, is an intriguing detail. Historically, the color scarlet is associated with redemption and sacrifice. Does this detail point to something greater? Some scholars see here a connection to the lineage of Jesus Christ, who, as a descendant of Perez, represents a redemption plan that transcends human logic. Perez, whose name means breach or breaking through, symbolizes God's ability to break conventions and bring forth a greater purpose. And then comes the great revelation. Perez not only was born under unusual circumstances, but he became part of the messianic lineage. In Matthew 1:3, Perez is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. What seemed like an irregular birth, perhaps even a scandal, was transformed by God into a pivotal moment in the plan of salvation. This is a powerful message for all of us. God can use even the most unexpected situations to fulfill his purpose. If you want to understand even more about Jesus' journey in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, we have a 90-day Bible reading plan that will help you see Jesus on every page of the Scriptures. The link to get started is in the first pinned comment below. But what about Zerah? Although he seemed passed over, he too carries profound meaning. His appearance with the scarlet thread may represent the promise of future redemption. While Perez leads the lineage of Christ, Zerah reminds us that everyone has a role to play in God's plan, even if we don't initially understand its scope. This story also raises bigger questions. Was Perez destined to be born first? Or does his act of breaking through symbolize the role of human effort within God's divine plan? Perez and Zerah show us that destiny and free will can coexist in ways only God understands. Not all twins in the Bible are biological. Some pairs stand out as spiritual twins, characters whose lives are supernaturally intertwined to fulfill divine purposes. A clear example of this is Moses and Aaron. From the beginning, Moses was chosen by God to deliver Israel from slavery in Egypt, but he wouldn't do this alone. In Exodus 4:14-16, we see God calling Aaron to be Moses' mouth. Aaron wasn't just an older brother, he was a complement, an extension of God's divine purpose for Moses. Together, they represented two sides of the same mission: prophetic leadership and the priesthood. This partnership wasn't by chance, but by divine design, uniting their lives for a greater goal. Another fascinating pair is David and Jonathan. Even though Jonathan was the rightful heir to Israel's throne, he recognized that God had chosen David for this role. In 1 Samuel 18:1-4, we read about their covenant, where Jonathan gives David his royal garments, symbolizing his submission to God's plan. This friendship was more than an emotional connection, it was a spiritual bond. They weren't competing, but collaborating within God's purpose, even if that meant sacrifice for Jonathan. These pairs lead us to reflect on the concept of spiritual twins as those whom God unites in mission. They may be completely different in personality, abilities, or backgrounds, but they share a unique calling. And here arises the question, are these relationships a result of human choice or divine predestination? Moses resisted his calling, and David faced persecution before reaching his destiny, but both needed their spiritual twins to fulfill what God had planned. The idea of spiritual twins also reminds us that no one fulfills God's purpose alone. Whether through alliances like Ruth and Naomi or missionary partnerships like Paul and Barnabas, we see that God often works through connections. These relationships are like two parts of one purpose, showing that unity in the body of Christ is essential for fulfilling divine plans. These reflections lead us to an even deeper mystery, the balance between destiny or free will. This is one of humanity's most complex questions, and the Bible presents stories that challenge our understanding of how these two concepts coexist. When we think of the biblical twins, such as Esau and Jacob or Perez and Zerah, we see that their lives seem to be wrapped in a divine plan, yet at the same time they are shaped by personal choices. Are these stories a reflection of the tension between what is written and what we can change? In Genesis 25:23, God declares that the older shall serve the younger, referring to Esau and Jacob before they were born. The prophecy seemed to seal their destinies. But look closely, Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils, a choice that revealed his spiritual neglect. Jacob, on the other hand, fought for the blessing even using questionable means. Were these decisions inevitable, or did God allow their choices to play a part in fulfilling his plan? The same applies to Perez and Zerah. Zerah, with the scarlet thread in his hand, seemed destined to be the firstborn. However, Perez broke through and took his place. Was this a biological accident or a sovereign act of God? These events show us that while God has total control over history, He also allows our choices to have a real impact. The Bible offers us an intriguing balance between predestination and responsibility. In Jeremiah 1:5, God says, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee." This reminds us that God has a plan for each of us, but at the same time, in Deuteronomy 30:19, He invites us to choose. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live." The biblical twins teach us that our decisions matter, even within God's sovereign plan. Esau had the free will to value his birthright. Jacob chose to fight for the blessing. Perez broke barriers. Each one in his own way contributed to a greater purpose, and the same applies to us. How are we using our choices to align our lives with God's purpose? But what if these stories weren't just historical events? What if they were signs of something much greater? Prophecies that connect to the end times. The Bible is clear about the final confrontation between good and evil. In Revelation 12, we see the dragon and the woman in a battle that reflects the separation of the wheat from the tares mentioned by Jesus in Matthew 13:30. Could the biblical twins, with their rivalries and spiritual struggles, be a forewarning of this great separation in the end times? One thing is certain, their stories point to the climax of history, when God will judge the earth and establish his eternal kingdom. The twins may also symbolize divided humanity. Since Adam, the struggle between flesh and spirit has been a recurring theme, and in the end times, this division will reach its peak, culminating in the final separation between those who belong to God and those who reject him. As we reflect on these mysteries, we are called to consider, which side are we on? Just as Jacob had to fight for his blessing and Perez broke barriers to be part of God's divine plan, we are called to take a stand in the final confrontation. Are we ready for what is to come? And so, we end our journey through the twins of the Bible, but the reflection continues. Their stories are not just about the past, but about what God is still doing today, and what he will do in the future.